The blood on Adelaide Turner's knuckles was not her own, and the man sprawled in the dirt outside the Bismarck saloon would think twice before putting his hands where they did not belong again. It was August 1878, and the Dakota Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets, turning everything golden and harsh. Adelaide stood there, chest heaving, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, aware of the circle of men who had gathered to watch. She was 22 years old, tall and lean, with her father's sharp green eyes and her mother's full mouth. Right now, those eyes were blazing with righteous anger. "Anyone else want to try their luck?" she called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. No one moved. The man on the ground groaned and rolled onto his side, clutching his jaw. Adelaide shook out her hand, feeling the sting of split skin across her knuckles. Her father had taught her to make a proper fist, to put her whole body behind a punch, to never hesitate when defending herself. He had been dead 3 years now, killed by pneumonia one brutal winter, but his lessons lived on in every movement she made. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the general store where she worked, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The crowd parted for her like water around a stone. Adelaide had earned her reputation in Bismarck. Men learned quickly that James Turner's daughter was not like other women, and those who forgot paid the price. The general store belonged to Mrs. Hendricks, a widow who appreciated Adelaide's way with numbers and her willingness to haul heavy crates without complaint. Adelaide pushed through the door, the bell jangling overhead, and went straight to the back room to wash her hands in the basin there. The water turned pink as she scrubbed away the blood. "That was quite a show," a voice said from the doorway. Adelaide glanced up to see Mrs. Hendricks standing there, arms crossed, but there was no judgment in her weathered face. The older woman had seen Adelaide fight before. "He grabbed me," Adelaide said simply, drying her hands on a cloth. "I did what my father taught me." "Your father was a good man," Mrs. Hendricks said, "but Adelaide, you cannot keep fighting every fool who crosses your path. One day you will meet someone who fights back harder." "Then I will fight harder still," Adelaide replied, meeting her employer's eyes steadily. Mrs. Hendricks sighed but said nothing more. They both knew Adelaide's choices were limited. She had no family left, no fortune, no prospects for marriage that did not involve some man thinking he could tame her. So she worked at the general store, lived in a small room above the bakery, and made her way through the world with her fists and her father's memory to guide her. The afternoon passed slowly, as afternoons in Bismarck often did. Adelaide helped customers, restocked shelves, and calculated accounts in the ledger with careful precision. Her mind wandered occasionally to her father, to the hours they had spent behind their old house while he taught her to fight. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and James Turner had raised his daughter alone, determined she would never be helpless. "You are small compared to most men," he had told her when she was 14, teaching her to throw her first real punch. "So you must be smarter, faster, and more willing to do what is necessary. Never fight fair, Adelaide. Fair is for people who can afford to lose." She had learned well. By the time she was 16, she could take down men twice her size. Her father had been proud, though he never said it in so many words. He had shown it instead in the way he trusted her to handle herself, to make her own decisions, to stand tall in a world that wanted women to be soft and quiet and obedient. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when the stranger rode into town. Adelaide was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store when she saw him, and something made her pause with the broom in her hands. He sat tall in the saddle, a man in his mid-20s with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at the ends beneath his hat. He wore dusty trail clothes and had the lean, rangy build of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. He dismounted outside the saloon with an easy grace, tying his horse to the hitching post and stretching his back with both hands pressed to his spine. Then he turned, and his eyes met Adelaide's across the street. They were blue, she noted, startlingly blue in his tanned face. He touched the brim of his hat in greeting, and Adelaide felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest before she turned away and continued sweeping with perhaps more force than necessary. She did not see him again until evening, when she was locking up the store for Mrs. Hendricks. The older woman had already gone home to her supper, leaving Adelaide to finish the closing routine. Adelaide was checking the lock on the back door when she heard footsteps behind her. She spun, fists already rising, to find the stranger standing there with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Easy," he said, his voice low and calm. "I am not here to cause trouble." "Then you should not sneak up on people in dark alleys," Adelaide shot back, but she lowered her fists slightly. "You are right, and I apologize, Yipor," he said. He had a slight accent she could not quite place, something that softened his consonants and rounded his vowels. "I am looking for Adelaide Turner. I was told she works here." Adelaide's eyes narrowed. "Who wants to know?" "My name is Thomas Pierce," he said, lowering his hand slowly. "I rode up from Texas with a cattle drive. I was in the saloon earlier when I heard men talking about the fight this afternoon. They said James Turner's daughter put a man on his back with one punch." "What of it?" Adelaide asked, her guard still up. Thomas Pierce shifted his weight, and, in the dimming light, Adelaide could see something that looked almost like embarrassment on his face. "I want to learn how to fight like that," he said. Adelaide stared at him. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was not among them. "You want me to teach you to fight?" "Yes," he said simply. "You are a man," Adelaide said, gesturing at his obvious height and build. "Surely you know how to throw a punch." "I know how to brawl," Thomas replied. "I know how to swing wild and hope I connect. But what you did this afternoon, that was not brawling. That was skill. That was someone who was taught proper technique by someone who knew what they were doing." He took a step closer, and Adelaide did not back away. "I have been in more fights than I can count," he continued, "and I have lost more than I have won because I never had anyone to teach me proper. My father died when I was 10, and I have been making my own way ever since. I am tired of getting my teeth knocked out by men who have no right to beat me except that they know how to fight, and I do not." There was something raw and honest in his voice that made Adelaide pause. She looked at him more carefully, seeing now the small scars on his knuckles, the slightly crooked set of his nose that suggested it had been broken before, the way he held himself like someone who expected to be hit and was always bracing for it. "Why should I teach you anything?" she asked, but her tone was less hostile now, more curious. "Because I will pay you," Thomas said. "I have money saved from the drive, and because—" He hesitated, then continued, "because I saw the way those men looked at you after the fight, like they were afraid of you, but also like they respected you. I want to be able to stand like that. I want to know I can handle myself, not just hope for the best and take the beating when it comes." Adelaide considered him for a long moment. The sun had almost set now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere down the street a dog was barking, and the sounds of the evening crowd at the saloon drifted on the warm air. "I teach you. You do exactly what I say," she said finally. "No arguing, no thinking you know better because you are a man. You listen and you learn, or we are done. Understood?" Thomas Pierce's face broke into a grin that transformed him from merely handsome to genuinely striking. "Understood," he said. "Meet me behind the livery stable tomorrow morning at dawn," Adelaide said, "and do not be late." She walked past him then, heading towards her small room above the bakery, but she could feel his eyes on her back the whole way. When she reached her door and glanced back, he was still standing there in the alley, silhouetted against the darkening sky, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. That night, Adelaide lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Bismarck settling into sleep. She thought about Thomas Pierce and his request, trying to understand why she had agreed. The money would be useful, certainly, but she had managed well enough without it. Perhaps it was the honesty in his voice, or the scars on his hands, or the way he had not flinched when she spun on him with her fists raised, or perhaps a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, it was the way his blue eyes had held hers, direct and unflinching, treating her like an equal rather than a curiosity or a threat. Adelaide pushed the thought away and rolled onto her side, determined to sleep. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and she would see if Thomas Pierce was serious about learning or if this was some elaborate game she had not yet figured out. Dawn came cool and pink, the summer heat not yet having settled over the land. Adelaide dressed in her oldest clothes, sturdy trousers, and a simple shirt that had belonged to her father, and braided her dark hair tightly back from her face. She splashed water on her face from the basin, ate a quick breakfast of bread and cheese, and made her way through the quiet streets to the livery stable. Thomas Pierce was already there, waiting in the yard behind the stable where the dust was deep and soft. He had changed into work clothes as well, and his hat was pushed back on his head, revealing more of his face in the early morning light. He looked nervous, Adelaide thought, which was oddly endearing. "You came," she said as she approached. "I said I would," Thomas replied. "Men say a lot of things they do not mean," Adelaide said, stopping a few feet away from him. "Let me see your stance." Thomas spread his feet and raised his fists, mimicking what he had probably seen in a dozen saloon brawls. Adelaide circled him slowly, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his weight was distributed all wrong, how his guard was too high and too tight. "Drop your hands," she said. Thomas obeyed. "Now forget everything you think you know about fighting. We are starting from the beginning." For the next hour, Adelaide took Thomas through the basics her father had taught her. How to stand with your weight balanced and ready to move in any direction. How to make a proper fist with your thumb outside, not tucked inside where it could break. How to pivot from your hips to put power behind a punch rather than just swinging your arm. How to keep your chin down and your eyes up. Thomas was a quick study, she had to admit. He listened carefully to every instruction and tried his best to follow them, even when it meant doing things that felt awkward or unnatural to him. He did not complain when Adelaide corrected his form for the 5th or 6th time, and he did not make jokes or try to diminish the lesson with false bravado. "Good," Adelaide said finally, stepping back. "That is enough for today. Your muscles need to remember these movements before we move on to anything more complex." Thomas lowered his hands, breathing a bit harder than when they had started. "When can we meet again?" "Day after tomorrow," Adelaide said. "Same time, and practice what I showed you in between. The movements should feel natural, not like you're thinking about each one." "I will," Thomas promised. He reached into his pocket and pulled out several coins, offering them to Adelaide. She hesitated, then took them. The weight of the silver in her palm was satisfying, practical. "Same time," she repeated, then turned to leave. "Adelaide," Thomas called after her. She paused and looked back. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded once and continued on her way, aware that something had shifted in her world, though she could not yet say what or how. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Every other morning, Adelaide met Thomas behind the livery stable and taught him what her father had taught her. They progressed from basic stances to footwork, from single punches to combinations, from defensive blocks to counterattacks. Thomas proved to be a dedicated student, showing up on time every session regardless of the weather or how tired he was from his work on the ranch outside town where he had taken a job after the cattle drive ended. Adelaide found herself looking forward to their lessons in a way that surprised her. She had spent so much of her life alone, keeping people at a distance because they either feared her strength or resented it. But Thomas seemed to genuinely admire her skills, and he treated her teaching with a seriousness that honored her father's memory. They began to talk during the lessons in the moments between drills. Thomas told her about growing up in Texas, about losing his father to a gunfight when he was young, about his mother's struggle to raise him and his 2 sisters alone until she remarried a cruel man who made their lives miserable. He had left home at 15 and never gone back, working his way north with various cattle outfits and ranch jobs, sending money to his sisters when he could. Adelaide, in turn, found herself sharing stories she had told no one else. About her mother, who she had never known but who her father had loved with a devotion that never dimmed. About the hours spent learning to fight, how her father had made it not just about self-defense but about confidence, about knowing her own strength and never apologizing for it, about the loneliness that came with being different, with being a woman who could not or would not fit the mold society wanted to force her into. Do you ever wish you were more like other women? Thomas asked one morning in mid-September, after they had been working together for nearly 6 weeks. They were sitting in the shade of the stable, passing a canteen of water back and forth, both of them sweating from the exertion of sparring. Adelaide considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she admitted, it would be easier, certainly, but then I think about what that would mean. Staying quiet when men speak over me, accepting less because I am told that is all I deserve, never knowing if I could defend myself if I needed to. She shook her head. No, I would rather be exactly who I am, even if it is harder. Thomas took a long drink from the canteen, his throat working as he swallowed. When he lowered it, he was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. I think you are extraordinary exactly as you are, he said quietly. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Adelaide had never felt before. She became acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the way a strand of Thomas's hair had fallen across his forehead, of the rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. We should get back to work, she said, standing abruptly and brushing dust from her trousers. If Thomas was disappointed by her retreat, he did not show it. He simply stood as well, settling back into his fighting stance with the ease of growing familiarity. But something had changed, and they both knew it. As September faded into October, the air grew cooler, and the leaves on the cottonwoods along the Missouri River turned gold and scarlet. Thomas's skills had improved dramatically under Adelaide's tutelage. He moved with confidence now, his punches sharp and precise, his footwork solid. They had progressed to full sparring, and Adelaide found herself impressed by how much he had learned, how he could anticipate her movements and counter them effectively. One morning they were circling each other in the yard, both focused intently on the match, when Thomas managed to catch Adelaide off balance with a feint she had taught him. She stumbled, and he reached out instinctively to steady her, his hands closing around her upper arms. They froze like that. Adelaide's hands braced against Thomas's chest, his fingers warm through the fabric of her sleeves, their faces inches apart. She could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could feel the rapid beat of his heart under her palms. I think you're ready, Adelaide said, her voice coming out huskier than she intended. Ready for what? Thomas asked, not moving, not releasing her. To handle yourself in a real fight, Adelaide clarified, though that was not what either of them was really talking about. What if I do not want to be ready? Thomas said. What if I want to keep coming to these lessons? Why would you want that? Adelaide asked, though she knew the answer, had known it for weeks now, had felt it growing between them like something inevitable and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Because of you, Thomas said simply. Because the best part of my day is these hours with you, because you are the most fascinating person I've ever met, and I think about you every moment we are apart. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped caring about learning to fight and started caring about you. Adelaide's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. No one had ever looked at her the way Thomas was looking at her now, like she was something precious and powerful and worth risking everything for. Thomas, she whispered, not sure what she meant to say next. He made the decision for her, leaning down and kissing her softly, gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wanted to. But Adelaide did not want to pull away. She leaned into the kiss instead, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt something in her chest break open and flood with warmth. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I know this is complicated, he said. I know you are not looking for a man to take care of you or tell you what to do, but Adelaide, I have to tell you how I feel. I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the first moment I saw you standing on that boardwalk with a broom in your hands and fire in your eyes. I do not need taking care of, Adelaide said, but her voice was shaking. I know, Thomas said. That is one of the things I love about you, but maybe we could take care of each other. Maybe we could be partners, equals. I would never try to change you or diminish you. I just want to be with you if you will have me." Adelaide pulled back enough to look into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive, but all she saw was honesty and hope, and something that looked an awful lot like love. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I have been alone so long. I do not know how to be with someone." "Neither do I," Thomas said with a small smile. "We can figure it out together if you want to." Did she want to? Adelaide examined her heart carefully, like her father had taught her to examine every situation before making a decision. She thought about the loneliness that had been her constant companion, about the walls she had built around herself, about the possibility of letting someone in and what that might mean. She thought about Thomas's patience and respect, about the way he made her laugh, about how alive she felt when she was with him. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I want to." Thomas's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Adelaide let herself fall into it, let herself feel the desire and connection and startling vulnerability of opening herself to another person. They stood there in the stable yard for a long time, holding each other as the morning light grew stronger around them. Two people who had both learned to fight their way through the world alone and were now, tentatively, beginning to believe they might not have to be alone anymore. The next few weeks were a revelation. Adelaide and Thomas continued their morning sessions, though now they were punctuated with stolen kisses and long conversations about everything and nothing. Thomas began courting her properly, as much as one could court Adelaide Turner. He walked her home from the general store in the evenings, brought her wildflowers he picked along the river, and sat with her on the steps of her boarding house, talking until the stars came out. The people of Bismarck noticed, of course. The town was too small for anything to go unremarked. There were those who disapproved, who thought Adelaide was too odd and too aggressive to make any man a proper wife. There were others who thought Thomas was a fool for attaching himself to a woman who could probably beat him in a fight. But Thomas and Adelaide paid them no mind. They were too wrapped up in discovering each other to care what anyone else thought. Adelaide learned that Thomas had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh in a way she rarely did, that he was surprisingly well-read for a ranch hand, having spent years of lonely nights with whatever books he could borrow or trade for, that he had a deep love for horses and a gentle way with animals that spoke of inherent kindness, that he had nightmares sometimes about his childhood, about his stepfather's fists, and would wake in a cold sweat before remembering where he was. Thomas learned that Adelaide was fiercely intelligent, with a head for numbers and strategy that would have made her a fortune if she had been born male, that she loved thunderstorms and would stand in the rain with her face turned up to the sky whenever one rolled through, that she was deeply loyal to the few people she let close, and that beneath her tough exterior was a capacity for tenderness that she guarded carefully, that she was terrified of becoming dependent on anyone, of losing herself in someone else the way she had seen so many women do. "I will never ask you to be less than you are," Thomas promised her one evening as they sat by the river, watching the water flow past in the fading light. "You do not have to diminish yourself to be with me." "What if I want things you cannot accept?" Adelaide asked, voicing a fear she had been carrying. "What if I want to keep working, keep making my own money, keep training and fighting when I need to?" "Then that is what you should do," Thomas said simply. "Adelaide, I fell in love with the woman who put a man on his back in the middle of the street. Why would I want you to be anyone other than that?" "Most men would," Adelaide said quietly. "I am not most men," Thomas replied. He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "And you are not most women. Maybe that is why we fit." As October turned to November, Thomas began talking seriously about their future. He had saved a good amount of money from his years of work, and he was considering buying a small piece of land outside Bismarck to start his own horse ranch. He spoke about it tentatively at first, clearly unsure how Adelaide would react to him making plans that might include her. "I want you to be part of this," he said one cold morning as they stood in the stable yard, their breath misting in the air. "Not because I need you to cook and clean and bear children, though if you wanted those things, I would be happy. But because you are smart and capable, and I genuinely think we would make better partners than I could ever do alone. You have a head for business, Adelaide. You could manage the books, help with training the horses, make decisions alongside me. We could build something together." Adelaide was quiet for a long moment, turning the idea over in her mind. She had never imagined a future like the one Thomas was describing. In her experience, marriage meant subservience, meant giving up everything she was to become an extension of someone else. But Thomas was offering something different. He was offering partnership, equality, a chance to build something that would be theirs together. "I would want it in writing," she said finally, "that the land and the business would be in both our names, that I would have equal say in all decisions." "Done," Thomas said immediately. "Adelaide, I would give you anything you asked for if it meant you would say yes." "Yes to what?" Adelaide asked, her heart starting to race. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. It was not fancy, but it was clearly real. Clearly something he had saved for and purchased with care. "Yes to marrying me," he said. "Yes to building a life together. Yes to taking a chance on us." Adelaide looked at the ring, then at Thomas's face, open and hopeful, and so full of love it made her chest ache. She thought about her father, about what he would have said. She thought he would have liked Thomas, would have respected him for treating Adelaide as an equal. She thought he would have wanted her to be happy, to find someone who saw her strength as something to celebrate rather than something to suppress. "Yes," she said, the word feeling like stepping off a cliff into open air. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas's whoop of joy startled the horses in the nearby stable, and then he was lifting Adelaide off her feet and spinning her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and Adelaide marveled at how right it felt there, this symbol of commitment she had never thought she would want. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Bismarck. Mrs. Hendricks stood up with Adelaide, and the ranch foreman where Thomas worked stood with him. It was not a grand affair, but it was honest and real. And when Adelaide spoke her vows, she meant every word. She promised to love Thomas, to be his partner in all things, to face the world at his side rather than alone. And when Thomas promised the same, she believed him. The ranch Thomas had been eyeing came up for sale that winter, and they bought it together, both their names on the deed, as Adelaide had insisted. It was a modest property, 200 acres of good grazing land with a small house that needed work and a sturdy barn. They moved in as soon as the papers were signed, and Adelaide threw herself into making it functional. She had worried that domestic life would feel like a cage, but it did not. Perhaps because Thomas never expected her to stay inside it, she kept the books and managed the finances while Thomas worked with the horses. She helped repair fences and train the animals, learning about horses with the same dedication she had brought to learning to fight. When they went into town for supplies, Thomas introduced her as his partner, not just his wife, and the distinction mattered. They worked hard that first winter, preparing for spring when they would begin breeding and training horses in earnest. The physical labor was demanding but satisfying, and Adelaide found she liked working with her hands, liked seeing the direct results of her efforts. Thomas was patient with her when she did not know something, and she was patient with him in return, and slowly they built not just a ranch but a real partnership. The bedroom they shared was another revelation. Adelaide had heard other women speak of marital relations with resignation or distaste, as a duty to be endured. But with Thomas, it was nothing like that. He was gentle and passionate by turns, always attentive to her pleasure, never taking without giving in return. He seemed to take genuine joy in learning what she liked, in the discovery of her body, and the sharing of his own. Adelaide, who had spent so much of her life armored and defended, learned what it was to be vulnerable with someone she trusted completely. "I love you," Thomas would whisper in the darkness, his arms around her, and Adelaide would say it back and mean it with her entire heart. Spring came late in 1879, but when it finally arrived, it brought new life and new possibilities. Their first foals were born healthy and strong, and Thomas began the careful work of training them. Adelaide handled the business side, reaching out to ranches and farms throughout the territory to let them know about their services. Her head for numbers and her straightforward way of negotiating earned them a solid reputation quickly. In May, Adelaide realized she had missed her monthly courses twice. At first, she tried to ignore it, to convince herself it meant nothing, but when the nausea began in the mornings, she could no longer deny what was happening. She was pregnant. The realization terrified her. She had never been around babies or small children, had never particularly thought about being a mother. She knew the dangers of childbirth intimately, had lost her own mother to it. The idea of going through that herself, of risking everything she had built, filled her with a fear she had never felt facing down an opponent in a fight. She told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch of their small house watching the sun set over their land. "I am pregnant," she said bluntly, because she'd never learned to soften difficult truths. Thomas's face went through several emotions in quick succession. Surprise, joy, wonder, and then concern as he registered Adelaide's expression. "You are not happy," he said carefully. "I am terrified," Adelaide admitted. "My mother died having me, Thomas. What if that happens to me? What if I'm not strong enough? What if I'm a terrible mother because I never had one of my own?" Thomas took her hands in his, holding tight. "You're the strongest person I know," he said firmly, "and we are going to make sure you have the best care possible. We will go to Fargo if we need to, find a good doctor. And Adelaide, you are going to be an amazing mother because you know what it is to struggle, to have to fight for your place in the world. You are going to teach our child to be strong and capable and true to themselves, just like your father taught you." "What if it is a girl?" Adelaide asked. "What if the world treats her the way it has treated me?" "Then she will have you to teach her to fight," Thomas said, "to defend herself, to stand up for what is right, to never back down. And she will have me to teach her that there are men in this world who will respect her strength rather than fear it. She will have both of us to show her that she can be anything she wants to be." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes, which was unusual enough to surprise her. "And if it is a boy? Then we will teach him to be the kind of man who makes the world better, not worse," Thomas said. "To respect women, to stand up for those who need defending, to use his strength to protect rather than to dominate. Either way, our child will be loved and cherished and raised to be a good person. That is all we can control, Adelaide. The rest we have to trust will work out." She leaned into him, letting him hold her as the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear. "I am still afraid," she whispered. "So am I," Thomas admitted. "But we will face it together, just like we face everything else." The pregnancy was not easy. Adelaide struggled with sickness that lasted well beyond the first few months, and the physical limitations of her growing body frustrated her deeply. She was used to being strong and capable, and the exhaustion and weakness that came with carrying a child made her feel trapped in her own skin. Thomas was endlessly patient, taking on more of the physical work without complaint, rubbing her aching back at night, and never making her feel less than for the vulnerability she could not hide. In August, as her time grew near, they made the journey to Fargo, where there was a doctor with experience in difficult births. They rented a small room near his office and waited. Adelaide paced like a caged animal, anxious and uncomfortable, counting down the days until she could meet this child she had carried and reclaim her body as her own. Labor began on a sweltering afternoon in late August, and it was every bit as terrible as Adelaide had feared. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, beyond anything her father's training had prepared her for. There was no fighting it, no technique to employ, nothing to do but endure as her body did what it was designed to do. Thomas stayed with her throughout, which was unusual for men of that time, but Adelaide had gripped his hand and told him if she had to go through this, he was damn well going to witness it. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool cloths, and whispered encouragement even when she cursed him for putting her in this situation in the first place. After 14 hours of labor, their son was born just as the sun was setting. He came into the world screaming, red-faced and furious, And when the doctor placed him in Adelaide's arms, she felt something shift fundamentally in her heart. He was perfect, this tiny creature, this combination of her and Thomas. He had Thomas's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair like Adelaide's. And when he wrapped his impossibly small hand around her finger, she felt a fierce surge of protective love that rivaled anything she had ever felt. "Hello?" she whispered to him, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, little one. I am your mother." Thomas was crying too, she realized, as he leaned over them both, his hand gentle on their son's head. "He is perfect," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Adelaide, you did it. You were so strong." They named him James, after Adelaide's father, with the middle name Thomas, James Thomas Pierce. When they brought him home to the ranch 2 weeks later, Adelaide felt like a different person than the woman who had left. She had faced her greatest fear and survived it. She had created life, this precious, vulnerable thing that depended on her completely. Motherhood was not easy, and Adelaide struggled with it more than she liked to admit. She was not naturally soft or nurturing in the ways she thought mothers should be, but Thomas reminded her that there were many ways to be a good parent, and that the fierceness of her love was just as valid as anyone's gentle cooing. Adelaide learned to hold her son with confidence rather than fear. She sang to him in her rough voice songs her father had taught her. She changed his diapers and fed him and walked the floor with him when he would not sleep. And as James grew from an infant to a baby to a toddler, she began teaching him the same things her father had taught her. Not just how to fight, though that would come later, but how to be strong and brave and kind, how to stand up for himself and for others, how to think before acting, and how to act when thinking was done. Thomas was a natural father, patient and playful in ways that balanced Adelaide's intensity. Together they made a good team. Just as they had in everything else, the ranch prospered as their reputation grew. Horses they trained were sought after throughout the territory, known for being well-mannered and responsive. The money they made was reinvested into the land, into building a larger barn, into buying better breeding stock. When James was 3 years old, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again. This time the fear was less acute. She knew what to expect, knew she could survive it. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1883, an easier birth than the first, as if Adelaide's body had remembered what to do. They named her Rose, after Thomas's mother, and she was a tiny, delicate thing that seemed impossibly fragile compared to her boisterous older brother. Rose proved to be anything but fragile as she grew. She inherited her mother's fierce spirit and her father's charm, a combination that promised to be formidable. By the time she was 2, she was following her brother everywhere, determined to do everything he could do. Adelaide watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, seeing so much of herself in Rose's stubborn independence. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. James grew tall and strong, learning to work with horses alongside his father, learning to fight alongside his mother. Adelaide taught him not just technique but philosophy, the same lessons her father had taught her about using strength responsibly, about defending those who could not defend themselves, about never backing down from what was right. Rose, when she was old enough, demanded the same lessons, and Adelaide gave them gladly. She would not raise a daughter who was helpless, who depended on others for her safety. Both children learned to ride almost before they could walk, learned to work hard, learned that their opinions and contributions mattered. Adelaide continued to help run the ranch, her business acumen proving invaluable as they expanded. She was not content to simply keep the books anymore. She had opinions about which horses to breed, which clients to work with, how to invest their profits. Thomas listened to all of it, respecting her judgment as much as his own, and together they built something that was truly theirs. There were difficult times, of course, a harsh winter in 1885 that killed several of their horses and nearly bankrupted them, a period when James was 12 and rebelling against everything, angry at the world in the way of boys becoming men. The time Rose, at 10, got into a fight at school with a boy twice her size who had been bullying a younger child, and Adelaide had to pretend to be stern while being secretly proud that her daughter had taken him down with a perfect hip throw. But through all of it, Adelaide and Thomas remained partners in the truest sense. They still trained together in the early morning sometimes, though now it was as much about staying fit as about actual fighting technique. They still talked for hours on the porch after the children were in bed, about everything and nothing. They still came together in their bedroom with the same passion they had discovered in the early days of their marriage, desire deepening into something richer and more complex with time. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked her one night when they were both in their 40s, their children nearly grown, lying tangled together in the darkness. "Marrying me? Giving up your independence?" Adelaide considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I did not give up my independence," she said finally. "I chose to share my life with you. That is different. And no, I do not regret it. You have been the best partner I could have asked for, Thomas Pierce. You have never tried to diminish me or control me. You have celebrated my strength instead of fearing it. How could I regret that?" "I love you," Thomas said, the words as meaningful after 16 years of marriage as they had been the first time he said them. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond, if such things are possible." "I love you too," Adelaide replied, and meant it with everything she was. James left for college in Chicago when he turned 18, wanting to study business and agriculture formally, planning to come back and apply what he learned to the ranch. Rose, at 16, was still at home, still training, still full of fire and determination. She had her mother's talent for fighting and her father's way with horses, and she had already declared she had no interest in leaving the ranch, that she wanted to keep building what her parents had started. Adelaide watched her children growing into themselves and felt a satisfaction she had never expected to feel. She had given them what her father had given her: strength, confidence, the knowledge that they could handle whatever the world threw at them. But she had also given them what she had not had: a stable home, two parents who loved each other and them, a foundation of security to build from. The ranch continued to thrive. They had expanded to 300 acres by 1892, employed several ranch hands, and were known throughout Dakota and beyond for the quality of their horses and their training methods. Adelaide's name was known too, though now it was associated with business savvy and excellent horse training as much as with her legendary fighting skills. She was 48 years old when Thomas got kicked by a spooked horse one autumn afternoon. Adelaide was in the barn when it happened, heard the crack of hoof against bone, saw Thomas crumple to the ground. The fear that seized her in that moment was primal, absolute. She ran to him, dropping to her knees in the dirt beside him. "Thomas," she said urgently, her hands fluttering over him, afraid to move him but needing to assess the damage. "Thomas, can you hear me?" He groaned, which was a good sign, and his eyes fluttered open. "Damn horse," he muttered, "caught me in the ribs." "Do not move," Adelaide ordered, then shouted for Rose and the ranch hands to come help. They got Thomas into the house and sent for the doctor from town. Adelaide sat beside him the whole time, holding his hand, her mind running through worst-case scenarios with the cold efficiency her father had taught her, even as her heart raced with fear. The doctor determined that Thomas had 3 broken ribs and severe bruising, but nothing more serious. He would need to rest for several weeks, take it easy for a month or 2 after that. Thomas was frustrated by the forced inactivity, but Adelaide was simply grateful he was alive. The incident reminded her, as nothing had in years, how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change. "You are not allowed to die," she told Thomas one night as she helped him into bed, her voice fierce to cover the fear underneath. "Do you understand me? You promised me a life together, and I am holding you to that promise." "I am not going anywhere," Thomas promised, wincing as he settled against the pillows. "It will take more than a horse kick to take me away from you, Adelaide Turner Pierce." He healed slowly but completely, and by Christmas, he was back to full activity. though more cautious around the horses than he had been before. They celebrated that Christmas of 1892 with James, who had come home from Chicago with a young woman he was courting, and Rose, who had just turned 20 and was as beautiful and fierce as her mother had been at that age. Adelaide looked around her table at the people she loved, at the life she had built, and felt a contentment she had never imagined possible back when she was 22 and alone, fighting her battles by herself in the streets of Bismarck. She thought about her father, about how proud he would be to see what she had become, what she had created. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked quietly, leaning close so only she could hear. "About how lucky I am," Adelaide said simply. "About how grateful I am that you walked up to me that evening and asked me to teach you to fight." "Best decision I ever made," Thomas said, kissing her temple. "Teaching me to fight, falling in love with you, all of it." James got married the following summer, and his wife gave them their first grandchild, a boy, in the spring of 1894. Rose continued to run the ranch alongside her parents, showing no interest in marriage, focused entirely on the work she loved. Adelaide suspected her daughter might never marry, might choose independence over partnership, and she supported that choice completely. Not every woman needed or wanted what Adelaide had found with Thomas. The years continued to pass in a rhythm that felt both fast and slow. Adelaide and Thomas grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies acquiring the aches and pains of age. But their partnership remained strong, their love deepening with each passing year. They still trained together sometimes, though now it was more about movement and flexibility than actual combat. They still talked for hours, still came together with desire tempered by familiarity, but no less meaningful for it. In 1898, when Adelaide was 54 and Thomas 57, they sat on the porch of the house they had built together and watched the sun set over land that was theirs, worked by their hands and their children's hands. James lived in the house next door with his growing family. Rose lived in the original house with them, though Adelaide suspected she would eventually build her own place on the property. "We did it," Thomas said, reaching over to take Adelaide's hand. "We built something real." "We did," Adelaide agreed. She looked at the man beside her, at the silver in his hair and the lines on his face, at the strength that remained in his frame despite the years. She thought about the scared young man who had asked her to teach him to fight, about how they had both been lonely and struggling and trying to find their way. She thought about everything they had built together, the family they had created, the legacy they would leave. "I would not change a single thing," she said. "Not one moment of it." "Neither would I," Thomas said. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Adelaide. Then now, and always." They sat there as the stars came out. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life based on mutual respect and deep love, who had proven that strength and partnership were not opposing forces but complementary ones. Adelaide thought about the girl she had been, tough and alone and defensive, and the woman she had become, still tough but no longer alone, still capable of defending herself but no longer having to face the world as an adversary. She had her father to thank for teaching her to fight, for giving her the tools to survive in a world that was not always kind to women who refused to be diminished. But she had Thomas to thank for showing her that strength did not mean solitude, that she could be powerful and loved at the same time, that partnership did not require surrender. The ranch continued to prosper under their guidance and eventually under Rose's management as Adelaide and Thomas grew older and began to step back from the day-to-day operations. They had earned their rest, everyone agreed, after decades of hard work. But they never fully retired, never stopped being involved. The ranch was in their blood, as much a part of them as their children or each other. Adelaide was 62 when Mrs. Hendricks died, leaving the general store in Bismarck to Adelaide in her will. It was a surprise, though perhaps it should not have been. Adelaide had been one of the few people who had treated the older woman with genuine friendship in her later years. Adelaide sold the store, but used the money to fund a scholarship for young women in Bismarck who wanted to learn a trade or attend school. something she thought both Mrs. Hendricks and her father would have approved of. Rose married at 34, surprising everyone, to a veterinarian who had come to the ranch to tend to a sick horse and had been immediately captivated by the fierce woman who knew more about horse health than most professionals. They married in a simple ceremony, much like Adelaide and Thomas's own, and the veterinarian moved onto the ranch, becoming an invaluable partner in the business. James's children grew and had children of their own, and Adelaide found herself a grandmother several times over. She taught her grandchildren the same things she had taught her children: how to stand strong, how to defend themselves, how to think critically and act decisively. She was a formidable presence in their lives, loving but demanding, always pushing them to be their best selves. Thomas's health began to fail when he was in his early 70s. Nothing dramatic at first, just a general slowing down, a weariness that rest did not fully cure. The doctor in Bismarck, a young man who had studied in the East, diagnosed it as heart trouble and said there was little to be done but rest and medication. Thomas accepted this with equanimity, saying he had lived a full and happy life and had no complaints. Adelaide was not nearly so accepting. She raged against the unfairness of it, against the fact that medicine had advanced so much but still could not save the people she loved. But Thomas calmed her, as he always had, reminding her that death was a part of life, that trying to fight it was like trying to hold back the river. "I am not ready to lose you," Adelaide told him fiercely one night as they lay in bed, her head on his chest, listening to the irregular beat of his heart. "You will never lose me," Thomas promised, his hand stroking through her hair, which had gone completely silver. "I will be with you always, in every lesson you taught our children, in every horse we trained together, in every sunrise over this land we built our life on. Death can take my body, Adelaide, but it cannot take what we have created together." Thomas died peacefully in his sleep on a cold January night in 1910, 3 weeks after his 71st birthday. Adelaide woke to find him gone, his hand still clasped in hers, his face peaceful. She did not cry at first, too stunned by the reality of it. She simply held him, this man who had been her partner for more than 3 decades, and memorized the weight of him, the stillness, because this was the last time she would hold him. The grief came later, in waves that threatened to drown her. She found herself angry at him for leaving, angry at the world for taking him, angry at herself for not being able to protect him from this one final enemy. But through the anger and the grief, she held on to what Thomas had told her. He was not truly gone. He lived on in everything they had built together. The funeral was well attended. Thomas had been respected in the community, known for his fairness and his skill with horses and his devotion to his family. People came from all over the territory to pay their respects. Adelaide stood dry-eyed through the service, her children on either side of her, accepting condolences with the same fierce dignity she had brought to everything else in her life. It was only later, alone in the house that felt too empty without Thomas in it, that she finally let herself cry. She wept for the loss of him, for the future they would not have together, for the loneliness that yawned ahead of her. But she also wept with gratitude for the years they had shared, for the love they had built, for the man who had seen her strength and loved her for it rather than despite it. Adelaide lived another 12 years after Thomas died. She never remarried, never even considered it. Thomas had been her partner, her equal, her great love, and she had no interest in trying to replace him. She threw herself into the ranch, into her grandchildren, into the life she and Thomas had built. She taught her granddaughters to fight, just as she had taught her daughter, just as her father had taught her. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the cowboy who had asked her to teach him to fight and had ended up teaching her how to love. Rose and her husband took over full management of the ranch, and it continued to thrive under their guidance. Adelaide remained involved, her mind sharp even as her body grew frailer, always ready with advice or observations. She was a formidable presence even in her 80s, still commanding respect from everyone who knew her. Adelaide Turner Pierce died in her sleep on a warm June night in 1922 at the age of 84. She was found the next morning by Rose, who came to check on her mother and discovered her peaceful in bed, a small smile on her face, as if she had seen something wonderful in her last moments. Perhaps she had. Perhaps Thomas had been waiting for her, ready to continue their partnership in whatever came next. They buried her beside Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The funeral was even larger than his had been because Adelaide had lived long enough to touch multiple generations. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were there, along with dozens of others whose lives she had influenced. People spoke of her strength, her business acumen, her fierce independence, her devotion to her family. They spoke of the legendary Adelaide Turner, who could take down any man in a fair fight, and the equally legendary Adelaide Pierce, who had built a ranching empire alongside her husband. The ranch continued for generations after, passed down through Rose's line, and managed with the same philosophy Adelaide and Thomas had established: hard work, fair dealing, respect for the animals, and the belief that everyone, regardless of gender, should be allowed to be exactly who they were meant to be. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Dakota hills, those who worked the land swore they could see two figures on the porch of the old house, sitting close together, hands entwined, watching over the legacy they had built with love and partnership, and an enduring belief that strength and tenderness were not opposites but complementary forces that, when combined, could create something truly extraordinary. The story of Adelaide and Thomas became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The story of the woman who fought like a man and the cowboy who asked her to teach him, who found in each other not just love but true partnership, who built something that lasted long after they were gone. It was a story about strength and vulnerability, about independence and connection, about two people who had both been alone and had found in each other the courage to be together. And though Adelaide and Thomas were gone, their love remained, written into the land they had worked, the children they had raised, the values they had instilled. It remained as a testament to what was possible when two people met as equals, when strength was celebrated rather than feared, when love was built on respect and partnership rather than domination and submission. Their story was not always easy, and their love was not simple or uncomplicated. But it was real and deep and lasting, and in the end, that was all that mattered. They had found each other in a harsh world, had built something beautiful together, and had loved each other until death and beyond. That was the legacy of Adelaide Turner Pierce and Thomas Pierce, the woman who fought like a man and the cowboy who loved her for it. Two extraordinary people who had proven that the greatest strength was not in standing alone, but in choosing the right person to stand with.